Last summer, my parents asked me to house sit for my aunt while she traveled through Europe. She owns a big old Victorian house in the countryside, full of creaky floors, secret nooks, and antique furniture. At 18, I thought spending a couple of weeks alone in a huge house would be fun. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, with the nearest neighbor a mile away. The nearby town was quaint, but didn't offer much. I spent my days exploring the house, reading books from my aunt's library, and occasionally hiking in the woods. It was peaceful, almost too quiet at times. One afternoon, rummaging through the attic, I found a dusty old journal in a chest. It belonged to the previous owner from the early 1900s. Intrigued, I took it downstairs to read. The journal detailed the life of a man named Edward, who seemed obsessed with the surrounding woods. As I read further, Edward wrote about strange occurrences, whispers at night, shadows among the trees, and a figure he called the Watcher. It was eerie, but seemed like the ramblings of a lonely man. I shrugged it off as fiction, or perhaps the onset of madness. That evening, while making dinner, I glanced out the kitchen window and thought I saw movement among the trees. It was just a flicker, probably an animal. Still, it reminded me of Edward's journal entries. I laughed at myself for being spooked, but deep down felt that something is not right. Anyway, I went back to cooking. After dinner, I settled into the library with a cup of tea and continued reading the journal. Edward's writings became more frantic, describing how the Watcher came closer each night. He claimed to hear footsteps outside his door and tapping on the windows. As the night wore on, I heard a faint tapping sound somewhere in the house. I paused, listening intently. It was probably a branch hitting a window or the old house settling. I tried to ignore it and returned to watching TV, but the tapping persisted, irregular and faint. Feeling uneasy, I decided to call it a night. As I headed upstairs to my bedroom, I thought I heard soft footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I hurried into my room, closed the door, and locked it, a habit I hadn't felt the need to adopt until that moment. Lying in bed, I tried to convince myself that I was letting the journal get to me. It was just an old story, and my mind was playing tricks. In the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of my doorknob rattling softly, as if someone were trying to open it quietly. My heart raced as I stared at the door, moonlight casting a pale glow through the window. The rattling stopped, and silence filled the room. I got out of bed. Shaking, I went to check the door. Pressing my ear against the door, I could hear faint breathing on the other side. Summoning all my courage, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response came, but the breathing seemed to fade away as if moving down the hall. That night, the weird stuff disappeared, so I could get some sleep. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps I had been dreaming. Determined not to let my imagination run wild, I decided to spend the day outside. I packed a lunch and set off into the woods to explore. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. As I ventured deeper, I found an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Curious, I approached it cautiously. The door was ajar, and inside was a mess of old furniture, leaves, and animal nests. I spotted a rickety table that had a collection of crude carvings made from wood and bone. They depicted distorted human figures and strange symbols that sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, I felt as if I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly left the cabin and hurried back toward the house. As I walked, I kept hearing rustling in the bushes behind me. I glanced back several times, but saw nothing. By the time I reached the house, I was out of breath and feeling foolish for being so scared. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the covers. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked with each step. I couldn't take it anymore. I swung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, now seeming to come from the attic above. The entrance to the attic was just down the hall. The ladder was down and the hatch was open, a detail I hadn't noticed before. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Climbing the ladder cautiously, I poked my head into the attic. The attic was filled with boxes and old furniture. Then in the far corner, I saw a figure crouching, its back turned to me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Is this real, what I am seeing? The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. He looked like a homeless person. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the ladder. Without thinking, I bolted back to my room and locked the door behind me. I called the police with shaking hands. I tried to explain what I'd seen, though I wasn't sure they'd believe me. They arrived within the hour and searched the house and attic thoroughly. They found no one and no signs of anyone having been there. Feeling helpless, I called my parents and told them everything. They urged me to leave the house and come home immediately. I packed my things and left that night, not daring to look back at the house as I drove away. The image of that grinning figure was burned into my mind. A few days later, my aunt returned and dismissed my story as stress-induced hallucinations. She said the house had always been a bit spooky, but assured me there was nothing to fear. I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that place. As I was leaving, I stopped by the town's small library, hoping to find something that might explain the strange happenings at my aunt's house. I discovered a local legend buried in an old, tattered book. It was said that in the days leading up to Halloween, the town and its surrounding woods drew dark forces, restless spirits, shadowy figures, and something known as the Watcher. According to the legend, each year, the veil between the living and the dead thins, allowing these horrors to roam freely, especially near old homes and hidden places in the woods. The townspeople knew to avoid these areas and had long warned travelers to do the same. So I'm not sure if I believe these legends. They sound too crazy to be true. But what I am sure of is that I always check my house before going to bed, especially when Halloween is near. And sometimes when the wind rattles my windows late at night, I can almost hear a soft tapping, like a faint reminder from that dark, empty hall.